Trying to understand the economy can feel like trying to predict a hurricane. Everybody, from huge global investors to governments, is just desperate to know what's coming around the corner. And the stakes? We're talking trillions of dollars, and really the health of the entire global economy.
So, can we actually do it? Is there some secret to seeing the future of the economy? It's not just the million-dollar question, it's the multi-trillion-dollar question.
Well, it turns out the answer might not be buried in some super complex algorithm. It might just be hiding in plain sight, in the words, the reports, and even the stories coming directly from the U.S. Federal Reserve.
All right, let's get into it. First up, we're going to look at the massive challenge of predicting interest rates. And to do that, we have to rewind to a time when the Fed, well, they didn't like to talk very much.
So everything here revolves around what's called the federal funds rate. Just think of it as the main lever the Fed pulls to either hit the gas on the economy or tap the brakes. For financial markets, guessing which way that lever is going to go next is a huge deal. It affects everything from your mortgage to your 401k.
But here's the thing. For decades, the Fed was incredibly secretive. Seriously. Decisions were made behind tightly closed doors, and markets were basically left to guess what was happening. It was a total black box, which, as you can imagine, created a ton of uncertainty and some pretty wild market swings.
But then, starting in the 1990s, things really started to change. You can actually see it happen in stages. In '94, they began to actually announce what they were doing with rates. A few years later, they started giving hints about the future. And by 2002, they were even telling us how the different committee members voted. That black box was slowly being pried open.
Okay, so it sounds good in theory, right? Be more open and people will understand what you're doing. But did it actually work? Did all this extra talking actually make the Fed more predictable?
Well, the evidence is pretty fascinating. Research from Eric Swanson shows that, the market's ability to predict the Fed's next move on interest rates got way better. But, and this is the really important part, our ability to predict the bigger stuff, like GDP growth or inflation, that didn't really improve at all.
So what's the big takeaway here? The Fed didn't give us a crystal ball for the whole economy. What it did was give us a crystal ball for the Fed itself. By talking more clearly about its own plans, it took away the surprise factor of its own actions.
Okay, but what about forecasting something even bigger, like an entire recession? Well, for that, we need to look at a totally different kind of communication. Not dry policy statements, but stories. This is where something called the Beige Book comes in.
The Beige Book is probably one of the most interesting things the Fed puts out. It's not a spreadsheet, it's not a list of data points, it's a collection of conversations, of anecdotes from real business people all across the country. It's ground-level intel about what's actually happening out there in the real world.
Now check this out. What happens when you take all those stories and use modern tech to measure the overall mood? Is it positive or negative? You get this chart. That blue line is the feeling from the Beige Book. The gray bars, those are recessions. I mean, the pattern is just impossible to ignore. That sentiment just nosedives right before or during a recession.
So researchers at the Boston Fed dug into this, and they figured out just how valuable this qualitative data can be. They found that if you add this Beige Book sentiment to the traditional forecasting models, it can actually make them better. But there are a couple of key details.
First off, it really shines in the short term. For predicting a recession in the next, say, 3 months, the Beige Book adds some serious value. But trying to predict a recession a full year from now, the signal gets a lot fuzzier. It's more like a short-term storm radar than a long-term climate model.
And the second cool insight is this. The real magic isn't in that polished national summary at the top of the report. It's buried in the details of the 12 individual district reports. The wisdom of the crowd from all that local, on-the-ground info is way more powerful. Okay, so let's put these two big ideas together. On one hand, we have these formal policy announcements, and on the other, we have these anecdotal stories. What do they have in common? Well, it all boils down to the power of communication. We've looked at two totally different ways the Fed communicates. One is super direct and formal, the other is all about storytelling. They seem like polar opposites, right? So what's the common thread that makes them both so incredibly useful?
At the end of the day, the core lesson is that clear and consistent communication is one of the most powerful economic tools there is. When the Fed talks, it leads to fewer shocks in financial markets. That gives businesses and investors more certainty so they can actually plan for the future. And that stability trickles all the way down to you, making for a healthier economy for your job and your saving.
So, this all brings us to the future.
If human analysts can pull these kinds of incredible insights just by reading the Fed's words, what happens when we unleash something way, way more powerful on them?
Just think about it. As AI gets so good that it can analyze not just every word, but the tone of voice, the context, maybe even the length of the pauses in a Fed chair's press conference, are we moving toward a future where big economic surprises just don't happen anymore? It's a pretty wild question to think about.